Before we begin, take a moment. If you find this story interesting, leave a comment with the number 1 and subscribe to support me. But if it's not quite your style, comment with the number 2 so I can improve and do better next time. Your feedback is my greatest motivation. The tranquility of the late hour was interrupted only by the soft hum of the refrigerator, a constant presence in the still kitchen. After completing the methodical task of washing dishes and wiping down the countertops, I felt a sense of calm that soothed my fatigued mind. Yet tonight, an unsettling tension permeated the air, disturbing the usual solace of my solitude. As I reached for the light switch, a subtle shift in the ambience behind me sent a shiver down my spine. A silent alarm went off in my mind, signaling an unexpected presence, making my heart race. I turned quickly, expecting an empty room, only to freeze. Standing in the doorway was a man, a stranger. His features were obscured by the shadows cast by the dim light, but his gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a wave of apprehension through me. I had never seen him before, had no idea who he was, and yet there he was, calm and still, an undeniable presence that disrupted the serenity of my night. "I did not intend to startle you," he said, his voice a silky baritone that carried a surprising warmth, momentarily alleviating my anxiety. He seemed unfazed, almost nonchalant, yet there was an aura about him, something enigmatic, something that made my skin prickle with unease. "No worries," I responded, trying to sound composed, though I could feel my pulse quickening beneath the surface. "I didn't hear you come in," I added, though I was very much aware of his sudden appearance. He grinned, as though sensing my discomfort, but he said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on me, a silent observer. The weight of his presence heightened my awareness of every movement I made. "Are you, hungry?" I asked, gesturing awkwardly toward the counter. I realized the peculiarity of offering food to a stranger at such an hour, but the words had already left my lips, hanging between us. He shrugged slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Why not?" he replied. I moved toward the refrigerator, attempting to ignore the unsettling sensation that his gaze was always on me, an eerie familiarity in his stare as though he could see through me, perceiving something about me I couldn't even grasp myself. As I began chopping vegetables, I couldn't help but ask, hoping to ease the tension. "What brings you here?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. He hesitated, his words carrying a gravity that suggested a deeper meaning. "I got a little lost on the way," he said, his tone light, though there was an undertone of mystery in his words. I couldn't quite decipher the depths of his meaning, but the air around us was charged, his casual demeanor masking something that felt almost dangerous. As we conversed about mundane things, the air between us remained thick with intrigue. His gaze lingered on mine, and in his pauses, I sensed that there were unasked questions hanging in the space between us, drawing me in. The tension built slowly, igniting a curiosity I could neither ignore nor fully understand. I felt drawn to him, yet repelled by the danger in his presence. Each small movement, like the brushing of his arm against mine, heightened the magnetic pull between us. We continued chopping vegetables side by side, his calm and controlled manner a subtle exhibition of confidence. My heart raced, a nervous excitement running through me as I became acutely aware of the slightest details, the warmth of his proximity, the way his fingers brushed mine as he reached for the knife. His presence filled the kitchen, transforming it from a space of routine into one thick with tension and unspoken desires. As we worked in silence, I began to sense the connection growing, the subtle intimacy of our proximity. Every glance, every shared silence seemed to amplify the unarticulated bond between us, and I could feel my pulse quickening as his eyes locked onto mine once more. "This place," he murmured, almost to himself, "it feels familiar." His voice was soft, his words heavy with something more than the moment we were in. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His words seemed to carry with them an unspoken significance, an invitation to explore something beyond the ordinary. The air in the kitchen felt charged with a tension that seemed to vibrate between us, a potential that I didn't fully understand but was unable to ignore. In that moment, I wanted to probe further, to understand what had drawn me to him, but his gaze held me captive. He didn't need to say anything else, his presence alone was enough to make the kitchen feel small, as if the world outside no longer mattered. Days passed, and the mysterious connection between us only deepened. Carter appeared unexpectedly, as if directed by some invisible force, his presence an undeniable thread that wove through the fabric of my solitude. The tension between us built with each passing encounter, a silent dialogue unfolding every time our gazes met. There was an unspoken bond between us that neither of us dared to acknowledge, yet neither could we escape. I knew I needed to distance myself, to sever the connection before it went too far. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I found myself drawn back to him. One evening, as I was preparing to close the kitchen, I glanced toward the doorway, and my heart faltered. There he was again, leaning casually against the frame. The dim light barely illuminated his face, but his presence was undeniable, magnetic. He hadn't spoken, yet his very existence in the room made everything else feel secondary. Even the most mundane action, like reaching for a utensil, seemed imbued with a quiet significance. And in that moment, I realized that I was trapped, caught in a web of intrigue and desire that I could not escape, no matter how much I tried. The atmosphere between us grew more charged, laden with an unspoken tension that made every breath feel labored. Our movements were slow, deliberate, as if guided by an unseen force, each action contributing to the intricate, silent choreography that seemed to play out between us. His gaze was steadfast, unwavering, and I could feel the weight of it, pressing on me like a tangible force. I locked eyes with him, and my heart began to race, the beat quickening in response to the storm of emotions simmering beneath his composed exterior. For a brief moment, the world outside us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us suspended in a space of unexpressed longing. Finally, I spoke, my voice striving to sound casual, though my pulse betrayed me, pounding against my ribs. "What brings you back?" I asked, my words barely audible, carried on a breath. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes still locked on mine. It felt as though he could see straight through me, past the walls I had built around myself, into the parts of me I had long since buried. "Perhaps I have a reason," he murmured, his voice low, almost a rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. There was an undeniable conviction in his tone, one that left no room for questioning. For a moment, I struggled to speak, the weight of the tension in the room stealing my breath. Every glance, every pause seemed to stretch into eternity, and I could feel my pulse accelerate, the effect he had on me undeniable. He knew it, too. I could see it in his eyes, in the way his gaze held mine, unflinching and intense. My attempt to fight the pull between us proved futile. Each glance and word exchanged only seemed to draw me closer to him, ensnaring me in a current I couldn't escape. Just as I felt my resolve weakening, he moved closer, diminishing the space between us. His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting contact, but it was enough to send a wave of heat rushing through me. I found myself leaning toward him, drawn by a force I couldn't understand, both terrified and exhilarated by it. "What motivates your repeated return?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely above a breath, fearing that speaking any louder would disrupt the delicate tension that hung in the air. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine as though he was trying to uncover something hidden, a truth that had yet to be revealed. For a heartbeat, I thought he might step back, but instead, he closed the gap further, his breath warming my skin. "I anticipated your invitation," he whispered, his voice carrying a subtle promise that both disoriented and electrified me. The air between us grew thick, almost unbearable. The tension was palpable, suffocating, yet it was also thrilling, a sensation I couldn't shake off. The days leading up to this moment seemed to converge into a fragile instant, one that I felt was about to break. Just as I gathered the courage to approach him, to surrender to the magnetic pull between us, a sudden noise shattered the moment, an unexpected clatter, the sound of glass hitting the floor. We both froze, the magic of the moment dissipating instantly. Our eyes met in surprise, and the atmosphere between us shifted. The warmth that had enveloped us drained away, leaving only a raw, unspoken understanding. There was something in his expression now, vulnerability, perhaps, or regret, that made him pull back, a step further than I was ready for. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible, as though the words were meant for himself more than for me. I felt the distance between us widen, an abyss forming where only moments ago there had been an undeniable connection. I reached out, my hand instinctively seeking to close the gap, to draw him back. But he recoiled, his movements stiff, as though restraining feelings he had not yet voiced. He hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe, his posture a mixture of hesitation and inner conflict. For a moment, I saw something in him, something deeper than the facade he had so carefully constructed. But then, with a soft sigh, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the stillness of the kitchen. The silence that followed was profound, the absence of his presence heavier than any words could convey. But as I stood there, leaning against the counter, a sense of resolve began to solidify within me. This was not the end, it was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with a restless anticipation, the memory of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, lingering in my mind. Each time I entered the kitchen, I half expected him to be there, his gaze silently pulling me into his orbit. And then, one evening, as if summoned by my thoughts, he appeared again. This time, I didn't notice his arrival until I turned, and there he was, standing just a few steps away, his eyes locking onto mine with that same intensity. My heart faltered in my chest, and I realized, in that moment, that everything outside the kitchen no longer mattered. "I didn't think you'd return," I whispered, my voice almost imperceptible. His look softened slightly, revealing a hint of vulnerability I had not seen before, and he closed the distance between us. The attraction between us was undeniable, and I felt powerless to resist it, even as I knew the consequences of giving in. The tension in the air was electric, and as he stepped closer, I realized that I was no longer in control. The mystery of him, the pull of his presence, had ensnared me completely. The space between us thickened, as if there were an invisible force binding us together. Like a moth drawn to a flame, I willingly became ensnared in his mysterious web. He gently reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face with his fingertips. Their lingering touch on my skin sent a shiver of awareness through me, and the sensitivity of his gesture startled me, starkly contrasting with the aloofness he often displayed in his gaze. In that moment, I briefly glimpsed the man behind his carefully constructed facade, a vulnerability that captivated and disarmed me. We stood close to each other, our breaths intertwining in the silence of the room. His lips brushed against mine in a tentative exploration, a question unspoken. Without hesitation, I leaned into him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders as the tension within me dissolved. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us, our bodies entwined, our hearts synchronized. As the kiss deepened, I felt a gentleness in his touch, a respect that made me feel valued. He grasped my hands, intertwining our fingers, anchoring me in the present moment, underscoring the undeniable connection between us. In his embrace, I found a tranquility I hadn't realized I was seeking. No words were necessary. Every unexpressed emotion and suppressed yearning found voice in the silence, in the warmth of his touch, and in the gentle pressure of his lips against mine. It felt as though we had discovered a missing piece of ourselves, a bond that defied reason and surpassed the limitations of our situation. We remained entwined in that embrace, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the outside world, which became irrelevant. It was just the two of us, suspended in a timeless moment, gently swaying together in the soft kitchen light, entranced by the rhythm of our illicit affection. As time passed, I realized that I was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as I had him by my side. Our hands remained intertwined, our hearts united. In his embrace, I felt a serene tranquility that filled me with a thrill so subtle yet profound, like returning home after a long journey. His lips grazed my cheek in a soft kiss, almost like a whisper, enveloping me in warmth and evoking a deep sense of familiarity I hadn't recognized before, a feeling I had been missing until now. As our kisses deepened, each one became more meaningful, marking the absence of constraints. My body grew warmer, and my arousal was palpable. The warmth and tenderness enveloped us, uniting us in a way that was both delicate and indissoluble. The room remained tranquil, with only the gentle hum of the refrigerator and our soft breaths disturbing the silence. In his firm hold, I experienced a profound sense of completeness, filling the voids in my heart. Words, explanations, and promises became unnecessary. It was everything in his touch, in the warmth of his embrace, a connection that was beyond reason, as if it had been destined all along. As we stood together, the external world faded into irrelevance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt profound peace and delight. The sensation grew inside me, unexpected but undeniably real, as if I had found something precious. The night unfolded in a calm tranquility, intertwined breaths and synchronized heartbeats resonating together. I looked up, observing the same scene reflected in his eyes, satisfaction, warmth, and tranquility, instilling hope in me. I was unaware that I needed the commitment to face whatever challenges the future held. It was a tacit understanding, a bond forged without words, stronger than any verbal assurances. In the warmth of the kitchen, I sensed a burgeoning optimism within me, a subtle conviction that we had discovered something extraordinary, an element that would sustain us through the challenges to come. The external environment became irrelevant as we stood there together, sharing this moment of peace and connection. The night unfolded in front of us like a new beginning. As we embraced, I realized I had discovered something profoundly significant, something I would treasure for a lifetime. This bond filled the emptiness in my heart, imparting a sense of tranquility and joy I had never known before. Despite being aware of the void, holding him closely, my heart synchronized with his every beat. As the minutes passed, I understood that whatever challenges awaited us, we would overcome them together. As dawn's light gradually illuminated the kitchen, it created a soft glow. I felt a profound confidence in my heart, a connection that required no verbal expression, a bond that warmed the surrounding air, uniting us in a way that seemed both fragile and indestructible. It was as if love had subtly established itself, bringing a sense of calm and joy that would endure long after the night faded into light. In the days that followed, the environment felt changed. Despite the familiar surroundings, I navigated my routine with a serenity I had never known, a calm that persisted even after he had left. Yet underneath, a subtle anticipation remained, a quiet restlessness, waiting for something elusive. His visits, though infrequent, were both unpredictable and inevitable. Each return brought an intensity, an unspoken bond that filled the space the moment he entered. One evening, while I stood alone in the kitchen, contemplating the quiet intimacy we had shared, I sensed a familiar shift in the atmosphere. A slight change confirmed his proximity. I turned, and there he was at the doorway. Today, his demeanor was gentler, almost vulnerable, as if revealing a side of himself he seldom showed. Without a word, he approached me, closing the distance between us with a calm inevitability that quickened my heartbeat. His palm grazed my arm, and warmth enveloped me, leaving me breathless. "You are here," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could think. He gave a gentle smile, tinged with nostalgia, and replied in his usual quiet tone, as if sharing a secret meant only for us. In that moment, it felt as though we were the only ones in the world, bound by an invisible, profound connection. We moved through the kitchen in a seamless rhythm, each glance, touch, and smile a silent language between us. But tonight, there was something different, an unusual heaviness in the air, a quiet intensity in his gaze. It was as if he was holding something back, something he wanted to communicate but couldn't. I reached out, lightly brushing my fingers across his arm, and he responded with a look that left me breathless. His eyes held a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, as if we were standing on the edge of an irreversible decision. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice a soft whisper. He didn't respond right away, instead gently taking my hand and leading me to the small table by the window. The streetlights illuminated us with a soft glow, and he regarded me thoughtfully, as if searching for the right words. In the stillness, with his hand in mine, a subtle tension grew between us, an expectant feeling as if the universe itself was holding its breath. As dawn's light softly crept into the kitchen, it seemed he was about to reveal something he had long kept hidden. His gaze softened, and though his voice was quiet and uncertain, it carried a depth that made my heart race. "There's something you need to know," he began, each word carrying weight. I stayed silent, listening intently as he inhaled deeply. The gravity of his words resonated within me. He spoke of moments of hardship and triumph, fragments of his past that had shaped him, revealing an intimacy that went beyond shared smiles or laughter. This was vulnerability, an exchange that was deeper than any words. When he finished, a profound silence filled the space between us, filled with unspoken understanding. I took his hand, my touch saying the words I couldn't express aloud. His expression softened, and a subtle gratitude shone in his eyes. We remained side by side, hands intertwined, immersed in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. As time passed, I felt a profound tranquility, a conviction that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eventually, he lifted his gaze to meet mine, tenderness lighting up his face. He gently squeezed my hand, a vow without words. I realized then that we would face whatever came next together, not through grand promises or declarations, but through the calm and warmth that had enveloped us. As morning's first light filtered through the room, a serene joy blossomed within me, a quiet hope that would remain long after the moment had passed. He helped me rise, and for an instant, our hands remained intertwined. We shared a knowing look, and together we stepped into the new day, still connected by that unspoken bond. The tranquility I felt was profound, as if I had found something rare and precious. Together, we moved forward, bearing the promise of future moments. Our story was still unfolding, a journey that would bring us closer, though the full extent of that connection was still to be revealed. But for now, we had each other, and in that moment, it was enough.